Hey everyone, so welcome to the live stream. What we're going to be doing in this one is, this is my first time doing a live stream here on YouTube, independently by myself in my stay-at-home order with my nice wall behind me. So what we're going to be talking about is full stack to cloud development in 2020. So what does that look like, right? When I think about full stack cloud development, what does that even mean? Let's break down those terms first. So full stack means being able to do front end, back end, be able to make APIs and also make front-end applications, which use HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all of those things, right? It's being able to do very basic design, things like that. So I think it's kind of a generalist side of it, but now we're kind of moving into a new space in 2020. We've been doing this in 2019 and 2018, but it's much more heavy and there's much more a precedent for full stack cloud developers in 2020 specifically. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So we defined the full stack part. That's front end, back end, building applications. So what is the cloud side, right? So what is the cloud development side? A lot of times when people hear cloud development, they hear operations, they hear maintaining containers, maintaining servers, making sure that the monitoring and the observability of our application actually is functioning. But what does that mean? What does that mean to me as a small independent person that might be building a startup? What does that mean to me if I'm at an enterprise level, right? And does that still hold true, right? Is cloud development still only working with containers and servers and doing those modifications, or is it something different? Is there a new emergence of cloud development and what that term might need to mean moving forward? So I'm Ryan Jones. I am the CTO and CEO of Serverless Guru. In this stream, we're going to talk about full stack cloud development as we described. And so now that we have that baseline there, let's actually move into what I would actually do if I was building an application from scratch in 2020. So the first thing I would do is I would be using React for my front-end framework. I would be using Amplify as the actual package in the front end that's actually going to connect to our backend. I would be using AWS AppSync, which is a service for fully managed GraphQL. I would also be using AWS, obviously, as a cloud provider. AWS AppSync is a service of AWS. So this is where we get into the cloud development side. I would be using DynamoDB as my backend database, and I would be using NodeJS as my backend runtime, and I would be using Lambda functions for any supporting functionality with AWS AppSync. And then on top of that, I would be using AWS Cognito. That's going to allow us to do authentication. And I would be using the serverless framework to actually deploy the backend and do local testing and things like that. So for instance, when we want to make the AWS AppSync GraphQL backend API, we want to spin up the database, we want to make the Lambda functions, we're going to be using serverless framework to actually push that up. So we actually have a course from Serverless Guru at training.serverlessguru.com. And on that course, it's called Zero to Paid Professional for Serverless. And I actually made that course a couple months ago, maybe six or 7 months ago, that covers starting in the AWS console and learning about how to build AWS Lambda functions, how to actually get started in cloud development. And it doesn't start off from the perspective of, oh, hey, I'm going to take the assumption that you've been doing this for 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. I'm going to take the assumption that you're starting from zero, right? And so gradually we move through the console step by step manually with no automation. And then as we start covering each different service that's important for building cloud applications in 2020, then we start moving into more advanced topics such as using the serverless framework to do deployments, to do local testing, to do naming standardization, all the things that you would want to be doing in 2020 for serverless application development or cloud application development. And so that term that I just used, serverless, right? Like, let's kind of break that down. What does that mean, right? And so what we used to have, if we dial back a little bit, we had on-premises servers, right? And this is still, obviously there's on-premises servers all over the place. If that word's not known either, basically what that means is that your laptop is a server, right? And in your house right now, if you're running that server, if you run npm run start, right, that is your local server. So you can imagine that we have a separate computer, which is our on-premises server. That's its only purpose, it's not for Chrome, it's not for Gmail, it's not for anything like that. Its only purpose is to run our web application. So that's our on-premises server, right? And then you imagine you scale that out over a big company. They have a whole bunch of these servers. They have to maintain all the costs, the security of it. If something breaks, they have to repair it. And then we got into the cloud, right? And so we had virtual machines. And so virtual machines are, you're still accessing a on-premises server somewhere, but you don't actually own it yourself. And so then from the on-premises side, moving to cloud and working virtual machines, we got to get rid of a lot of that expense and the repair bills and all the other headaches that come along with running those servers. And then moving into the next phase of that, we got into containers, we got Docker, and we got Kubernetes is now popping up. And we have these other ways to actually use less of that server, right? So we're becoming much more optimized, right? So before with the, let's say the on-premises or the virtual machine, you had one server, right? You can imagine it's a big box, but you couldn't actually break that box up into separate pieces and different compartments. So it's just one big box and you put your stuff on that box and hopefully you tune it the right way. It has enough CPU, enough all of these different dials that it can actually support your application load. The problem is that as things would scale up, right, you would get a lot more requests, it would fall over. And it would fall over because things, when you're working at that level, you have to have all this extra automation. So if you have this box that says, okay, this can support 10,000 users, what happens if you get 20,000 users? What happens if you get 100,000 users or 1 million users? How does your application react? Is it flexible? Is it agile enough to actually scale with that usage, or is it going to fall over? And that's where we got into containers, as we talked about. It's able to put multiple containers onto one single server. So now we're using much more of the actual work. We're using much more of the entirety of that box. Then the next phase of that is what we've been describing as serverless in some form. The term has kind of evolved since then. So the next phase after containers was functions as a service, right? So it's called FaaS. Functions as a service, just like the containers to the virtual machine, you're less surface area, right? So you can fit much more function invocations happening on a server or even on the container itself than what that initial, I have one server for my whole web application, right? I have one server for all of my backend processes, right? Now we're actually breaking down those backend processes into separate functions. So each function is very granular, it's very small, and that's called functions as a service. That was the initial emergence of the term serverless. What that allows you to do is when you're working with serverless, you're no longer worrying about the container. You no longer worry about the server. You never think about the, where is this running and what data center that does Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud or Azure, where is this actually running? None of that stuff actually matters. Installing the operating system doesn't actually matter. The only thing that matters is being able to write your NodeJS code, and that's how I'm looping it back into the full stack cloud development. All that matters is writing your NodeJS code, putting it into a zip file, dropping it onto AWS Lambda or another cloud provider, and then it's actually able to start receiving requests. So underneath that, as you get requests, it's actually going to turn on. And if you don't get requests, it's going to turn off. And you can imagine it like, let's say that you have this room, right? Like the room that we're in now. And let's say when I walk in, the lights turn on. But usually, I'm flipping that switch, right? I've turned the lights on myself. But then when I walk out, I have to remember to flip the switch off, right? The problem with that, though, is that you run into issues where if I'm not home, the lights may be running constantly. Let's say it was a restaurant, maybe the lights need to always be running. But let's say that we optimize that, right? And so this is where the serverless aspect comes in, the functions of the service. Now, when we actually walk in, the lights turn on. When we walk out, the lights turn off. There's no one here. We don't need to have the lights on. We're absolutely saving money because it's not running 24/7. The best thing about that is that we didn't actually write that automation ourselves. Behind AWS Lambda, it has the ability to, when a request comes in, it'll start the server, it'll put your application code on it, it'll receive the request and then respond back, and then the server will die. And you only pay for the amount of time that your actual function code was running. You're no longer paying 24/7 for a container running or 24/7 for a server on premises or cloud virtual machine is running. And so those are the benefits of it. So why do we need to worry about so much, right? Like that seems like a lot. So let's kind of erase the on-premises. Let's erase the cloud virtual machines. Let's also erase the containers, right? So now full stack development may be at a lot of companies. You have your React, your Angular front end. You have backend APIs that you're interacting with, and then you have an Express server or something like that, right? And so you're not running it maybe on something that's very complex like the cloud currently. Maybe it's being run on a server that y'all have at your office. It's not very complex. It's very simple. One person can actually work on both the Express side of it because it's JavaScript and Node.js, and also the front end because you're using JavaScript as well. And so people are already doing this, but now there's the aspect of the cloud, right? There's the aspect of being able to scale to a company such as like Lyft, for instance. Let's just use them. And so being able to scale to that level requires all these different services. And so there's a complexity level there. And that's why it can seem very like there's this huge barrier of entry to actually do quote unquote full stack cloud development. But what I just described, and anybody can do this, is create an AWS account, go into the console, take the 0 to paid professional course, at least the first part of it, and you can see this. Take your Node.js code, put it into a zip file, drop it onto the AWS console. There you go. Now you have your cloud function. Make a connection to another fully managed service called API Gateway. Now you're going to connect your Lambda function to API Gateway, and it can actually receive requests. And you're going to get this URL automatically that you can then put into your React or your Angular front-end application, and you can actually make API requests to your backend. You never had to worry about the server. You never had to worry about the container. You never had to worry about any of the other operational overhead that's involved with that. It's very simple to use. And as you get that first Lambda function up and your first backend API running with serverless, then you can actually start moving into things like infrastructure as code. And I cover that in the course as well. We use a serverless framework to do that. And we gradually build up on that knowledge as we move through that course. But to wrap up here, how I would build an application from my experience over the past three plus years working with front end and back end applications for lots of different clients and people that I work for as an employee. How I would build it, and I would use React in the front end, Amplify, AWS is my cloud provider. I would use AppSync, a fully managed GraphQL. I would use DynamoDB as my NoSQL database. If I needed to use a relational database, I would use AWS Aurora serverless. And then if I was going to host my website, right now there's a little bit of stuff around like hosting and SEO purposes with single page applications on AWS, or when it comes to static hosting. For that specifically, if I needed really good SEO, if this wasn't a proof of concept, I would use something potentially like Elastic Beanstalk to host that application, host a website front end, just so that I get that little bit of scaling for usage, as well as being able to run my own SEO stuff to wrap over my React application, for instance, to make sure that my single page application actually can have good SEO as if it was individual HTML files, right? So if you're not worried about SEO, I would use an S3 bucket. I would turn on website hosting, and you can go to medium.com/serverlessguru, and you can look at one of our most popular articles is actually how to deploy your React.js application on AWS S3. We also have an article called how to deploy my Angular application on AWS S3. And so you can check that out. What that's going to allow you to do is now you have your front end with React and Amplify, AWS AppSync with your GraphQL queries. You host that on AWS S3. Now you have a live URL where people can actually interact with your app. In the backend, you've got Lambda functions, which have your Node.js backend code. You don't have to worry about Express. You're just worrying about your Node.js functions and how the connection works with AWS Lambda. It's covered in that course. It's very simple to set up, very easy. And then past that point, you have a DynamoDB table, maybe an S3 bucket to store like images or documents. And that's pretty much your app. That's why I say full stack cloud development is the entire thing. It's not just front end. It's not just back end. It's not just cloud. These aren't just like separate pieces to make an application. It's actually an entire thing because, personally, I've been working on a side project and I'm able to build out the front end with React. I'm able to build out with Amplify to connect with my AWS AppSync GraphQL API. I'm able to build the supporting Lambda functions with a little bit of Node.js code. I'm able to use DynamoDB for my NoSQL data store. I'm able to use the serverless framework to deploy all of this, and I'm doing it just me, right? And so I have additional people that are on my team that are going to start helping soon. But for the most part, all of these different deployments and all the different things that I'm doing, building out this entire application, this full stack application, full stack cloud application, is being done by one person, right? And I'm not an anomaly. This is being done all across the board. And this is what you're going to see a lot more coming into the end of 2020, into 2021, 2022, is you're going to see developers being supercharged, having all these different tools, these fully managed tools that they can pull from to build applications at a rate and at a quality level and the scaling level that was not able to be done 5 or 6 years ago. So we're now at a maturity level with serverless. We're actually seeing the adoption rate increase, and we're seeing the ability for individual developers to be even more effective at their job. So that was a kind of quick overview of how I would build an application, a full stack cloud application in 2020. Hopefully you find that useful. Let me know in the comments if there's any other things that you would want to learn about or hear my opinion on. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.